For 379 days, Ukraine defends itself against the Russian invasion. Yesterday morning, Russia conducted another large-scale missile and drone attack against Ukraine, reports Ukrainska Pravda. According to Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces Valery Zaluzhny, Russia has fired 81 missiles of various types over Ukraine, with Ukrainian air defense forces shooting down 34 out of 48 cruise missiles. 4 Shahed drones were destroyed as well. Spokesperson for the Air Force of Ukraine, Yuri Ignat, pointed out that it was the first time when Russia launched 6 Kinzhal hypersonic cruise missiles. Those are the newest missiles in Russian arsenal and cannot be intercepted by the air defense means Ukraine has. Russia also launched 6 Ha-22 cruise missiles that have the largest warhead among those that Russia has, 950 kg. In the result of the attack, at least 5 people were killed in Lviv Oblast when the enemy missile fell in a residential area in Zolochiv district, destroying 2 houses. All of the victims are civilians. In Kyiv, the attack resulted in 3 people wounded, 5 cars burned and another 15 damaged. Overall, 3 thermal power plants belonging to the private DTEK Energo were damaged. No casualties have been reported there. Slovak Defense Minister Jaroslav Naď said that Poland has agreed to jointly provide MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine, and it is time for the Slovak government to make a decision on this issue, reports European Pravda. He did not specify how many planes could be given to Ukraine, but earlier Slovakia was considering providing Kyiv with 10 of its 11 Soviet-made MiG-29s. All those planes are no longer in service. Later, the Polish president's office confirmed that Warsaw is ready to provide Kyiv with a certain quote-unquote not large number of Soviet MiG-29 fighter jets. Poland transferred the remaining 10 of the 14 promised Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, reports Unian. According to the Polish defense minister Mariusz Błaszczak, the training of Ukrainian servicemen on Leopard 2 tanks was recently completed in Poland. He added that he is negotiating with his Spanish colleague Margarita Roble regarding the possible provision of more tanks for Ukraine, perhaps 4 more. Commander of the Ukrainian ground forces Oleksandr Syrsky believes that the relevance of continuing the defense of Bakhmut in Donetsk Oblast is only increasing, reports NVUA. He stressed that every day of the city's defense allows Ukraine to win time to prepare reserves and prepare for future offensive operations. At the same time, in its fight for this fortress, the enemy is losing the most prepared and capable part of their army, the Wagner assault units. Syrsky said that Ukrainian forces did not allow Russians to take the city into operational encirclement, but the situation remains complicated, reports Ukrainska Pravda. He admitted that the situation there is dynamic. The Defense Intelligence of Ukraine informed about the first 5 months of use of the satellite purchased with the donations from Ukrainians, reports Novinarnya. According to them, the ICI spacecraft has helped to detect and destroy thousands of pieces of Russian military equipment. For example, 45 planes, 27 helicopters, 6 Iskander mobile short-range ballistic missile systems, 36 S-300 anti-aircraft systems, 11 radar stations, and many more. On 18 August 2022, Sergei Prytula, Ukrainian comedian, TV host and activist, reported that his foundation had purchased a satellite and access to a satellite imagery database for the Ukrainian army for more than a year for $16.3 million donated by ordinary Ukrainians. The American Film Academy refused to show the address of the President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky at this year's Oscar Awards ceremony, reports Radio Liberty. According to the sources of the Variety magazine, this was the second time that the organizers of the award have refused Kyiv. According to the sources of the publication, he expressed concern that Hollywood is paying attention to the war in Ukraine because it concerns white people, but is ignoring the rest of the conflicts around the world. Kyiv did not officially announce the president's desire to speak at the ceremony, but Zelensky's addresses were shown at the Cannes, Venice, and Berlin film festivals and at the Golden Globe Awards ceremony. The Oscar ceremony in 2023 is scheduled for March 13th. This will be the 95th ceremony. If you like what we do and would like to tip us, you can now do so directly to our PayPal. Check out the link in the description to this episode for more details. And as usual, you can subscribe to our Patreon.
You have this amazing piece in the Wall Street Journal about how the era of great power competition is reemerging. I mean, we went through that in the Cold War, and then after, 1989, we thought it was receding with Russia, and then 9/11 made it that we were fighting insurgencies. Tell me what you mean about the rise of the superpower confrontations.
Well, this, in fact, is the main business at the Pentagon and has been really since 2018. And following the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and to a certain degree in Syria against ISIS, there was a stock taking at the Pentagon and a reevaluation of what the next missions would be. And it was determined that the Pentagon really needed to gear up for what they called at the time a world of great power competition, which was a thin euphemism for China and Russia. That was a strategy that was promulgated by then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, but the Biden administration has doubled down on it in its own version of the strategy, which it issued last year.
And so does that mean we change the way we procure weapons and do a lot of things with a focus on the fact that we may be fighting Russia and China, not insurgency wars?
It requires a very substantial transformation of American defense in terms of where we put our forces, the kind of military technology and weapons that the U.S. buys, the very structure of some of the armed forces has to be rethought. They have to find a way to connect them all up so that they can share targeting information in real time, because the task of deterring China, which is the primary threat, according to the Biden administration's Pentagon, is just an enormous undertaking where you're dealing with a potential adversary really that has the home court advantage, with Taiwan just 100 miles from the coastline of China.
If you read, and you're a great military historian, but you go back to Thucydides and obviously Bismarck and Metternich, you talk about great power competition, but the real warning they always have is never get into a great power competition with two different great power adversaries, especially when you're pushing them closer to each other. Aren't we making that mistake with Russia and China, moving them closer to each other as we become adversaries to both?
No, they've moved themselves closer to each other. I don't think you could fault the United States for that. I mean, what's happened is we just have to deal with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. And in this world, China has been, its military might has been growing substantially. It has a strategy of trying to coerce Taiwan politically to rejoin China and to extend its jurisdiction over that. At the same time, Vladimir Putin has his own agenda, which we've seen play out in Ukraine to kind of push back NATO. And these two countries have found common cause with each other against the United States. I don't know that you could call it a formal alliance, but they clearly see benefit in cooperating to a certain degree in their kind of broader project to diminish American influence around the world. So this is an enormously challenging thing for the Pentagon, because it has to be prepared to both deter a conflict in the Western Pacific, thousands and thousands of miles away from the United States, and simultaneously deter a conflict in Eastern Europe, halfway around the globe. And what makes it even more complicated is that China and Russia have both studied how the United States went to war in Desert Storm against Iraq, and they've devised novel strategies and tactics to try to frustrate the U.S.
You've written a book recently called Degrade and Destroy, which is about the campaign against ISIS that we're fighting. The book comes out in paperback soon. Tell me what lessons we learned from these insurgency wars, or maybe bad lessons we learned that apply today.
We had advantages in fighting ISIS and in fighting al-Qaeda and even fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan that we don't enjoy against China. For example, in those conflicts, we had totally unrivaled, uncontested air supremacy. These insurgent and militant forces didn't have an air force. They didn't really have effective surface-to-air capabilities. So we had air dominance. None of that would apply in a war with China. Second of all, we had bases throughout the region from which we could project power, ground power, air power, and the like. And these bases were largely immune from enemy attack. That also wouldn't be the case in a conflict with China. They'd go after our bases in Japan and Guam from the get-go. So the war against ISIS was very similar, but there are some lessons, which is that in the war against ISIS, we relied extensively on the Iraqi military, on Syrian forces to be the ground element. We didn't put a lot of American forces in combat. There were some, but not a lot. So we let them do the main fighting. I think that's the way of the future for wars in the Middle East. Why is that? Because our main focus is going to be on China and Russia. And if we're going to have to tangle with militant forces in the Middle East, at least, we're going to want to rely heavily on partners on the ground instead of our own troops. One exception would be if there's ever a war with Iran. But I think one of the lessons is the war against ISIS showed how we need to fight in the Middle East if we are going to put most of our effort into deterring China and Russia.
Are we in an inevitable conflict with China?
Well, it's hard to foretell what's going to happen in the American relationship with China. But in the case of China, their project to extend their influence and control over Taiwan is at variance with the American posture in the Western Pacific, which is to defend free trade, to protect allies like Japan in the region, whose security would be greatly compromised if the Chinese were in control of Taiwan.
And do you think President Biden's taken that a little bit further, the defense of Taiwan situation?
He's taken it a lot further because the policy had... the official policy is still one of strategic ambiguity. And what is the policy? We provide arms and weapons to Taiwan. We provide a limited number of trainers. The Wall Street Journal recently had a story on how that was going to be expanded, but it's really a small number. We are trying to give Taiwan the capability to defend itself against China in order to deter China from ever forcefully trying to take over that island. Where the ambiguity comes in is the U.S. is left unclear whether it would employ its own forces to come to Taiwan's aid. Now, what President Biden has said on more than one occasion is that the U.S. would. And the Pentagon, in fact, is planning to do so, not because a decision to do so has been made, but because you have to have the plans and the capabilities in hand in advance in case you're called on to do so. Now, one thing that's important to recognize is the Pentagon doesn't think China can take Taiwan today. It would be an enormously challenging task for China. They have to do an amphibious landing, which they've never really done. They would have to, China forces haven't fought with the Americans really since the Korean War. So it's highly ambitious. And in fact, according to the CIA, the current Chinese military leadership is not confident it could carry out such an operation today. But Xi Jinping has instructed his own forces to be ready to do so in 2027, according to the CIA. That doesn't mean they would do so, but it means that he wants to have at least that option, at a minimum for political coercion, and perhaps more than that. So what's going on now is there's a race. There's a race between the Chinese to get ready to develop this option, and there's a race by the Pentagon to develop the capability to counter the option so the Chinese don't employ it. And in this race, we're trying to develop new capabilities and deploy additional forces. And many of these programs won't come to fruition until the 2030s. So the next 5 years are a pretty anxious period for that part of the world.
You wrote in your piece about war games, that we play sometimes. And you can explain what a war game is, but it's something the Pentagon does. Tell me about the war games that's been happening on the concept of a struggle in Taiwan.
Well, the Pentagon does highly classified war games or simulations. They're all done in kind of computer simulations and conference rooms and in military bases. And in my recent article, I recount one that was done in 2018. And there is an Air Force general, he's a Lieutenant General Clint Highnote, and he had recently been assigned from the Middle East to come back to the Pentagon and be one of the people planning the future of the Air Force. In fact, today he's in charge of that task. He's Air Force Futures is what the office is called. And he comes back and he told me all on the record that, he's when he first saw the results of the war game of how he would fare in a conflict with China, the expression he used was, holy crap, we're going to lose if we fight like that.
So what went wrong? What were we missing?
Unlike a conflict in the Middle East, if you assume there'll be a war with China, our air bases in Japan are going to come under missile attack almost immediately. Our naval base in Guam is going to come under attack immediately. This is going to interfere with our ability to replenish subs at sea, and subs are really important. Our ability to supply our own troops with logistics is going to come under fire. There's a terminology for this in the Pentagon. They call it contested logistics. None of that was true in our wars in the Middle East. We assembled forces over a period of 6 months. If you remember the Gulf War, no one interfered with that. We picked a time when we wanted to initiate the conflict, and then we did without any interference. Well, that wouldn't hold in a war with China. So what General Hynut was pointing to was that these assumptions with regard guided the U.S. employment of force in previous conflicts would no longer obtain. Therefore, you need a totally new concept for how to do this. You need to have some forces that could survive within range of the Chinese missiles. That's what the Marines are trying to do now. You have to have additional standoff capabilities, long-range missiles that you could fire from a safe distance into there. You have to integrate these capabilities in novel ways. So it's not merely a matter of shifting our current military to another part of the world. It's a matter of coming up with what the Pentagon calls new operational concepts, new forces and new ways of employing the forces to deal with a threat that's entirely different from the one that we've been involved with for the past few decades. And then you have to factor into this the possibility that if Russia and China are not formal allies, if we were caught up in a conflict in the Western Pacific, Russia might act opportunistically to pursue some aims in, let's say, Eastern Europe. And we know the Russians have had a hard going in Ukraine, but you still have to be prepared for the contingency that, let's say, a decade or two from now, they might strike out somewhere else, thinking we were bogged down in the Western Pacific. So it's a really very formidable challenge.
We talk about one of the battles coming up, which is the budget battle. And that's really beginning this week and next week. And so many times over the past decade, the budget battles have caused us to spend more in some ways on weapons, even as we try to spend less. We spend as much as the next 9 militaries combined, and yet we don't get a whole lot of bang for the buck. What do you think is the problems we're facing with our budgeting strategy?
Well, I do think we get a lot of bang for the buck. And I feel that the idea of comparing American spending to other countries is a little misleading because, first of all, we have a professional military that pays a lot more than the Chinese military pays. So personnel costs eat up a lot, as does healthcare. Also, the United States has global responsibilities. They're trying to deter Chinese aggression and Russian aggression in totally disparate parts of the world. There's no other country that has that as a mission. So to compare our budget with countries that have niche capabilities and limited responsibilities, I don't think it's directly relevant. The Congress is sometimes been helpful to the Pentagon. I mean, here's an example. They've added money to the Pentagon budget in recent years, primarily because of their concern over the China threat. So last year, when the Pentagon proposed a research and development budget of $130 billion, that's an enormous amount of money. It would be the highest R&D budget in Pentagon history. Well, the Congress added $10 billion to that, saying, well, we got to do more on hypersonics and other technologies.
The Biden administration has put $25 billion, I think, in weaponry into the Ukraine conflict. Tell me how that's affected this strategy and our military readiness.
Well, I don't think it's affected our military readiness in a bad way. I may have a slightly iconoclastic view on this. It's certainly we spent a lot of resources in Ukraine, but a lot of the weapons that, number one, we're giving Ukraine from drawdowns from our own stocks, 155 artillery shells, javelins, things of that sort. I mean, those are not the kind of weapons U.S. military is going to use in a war with China. We're not fighting a land war with China. We'd be operating with, long-range anti-ship missiles or marine forces with anti-ship missiles and the like, hypersonic missiles. We're not going to be fighting trench warfare with the Chinese. So some of these weapons that are being provided to Ukraine are not relevant for a U.S. fight with China. The second point I would make is, the Russians have lost more than 1,000 tanks. They've lost a substantial part of their armed forces. They've had more than 100,000 killed and wounded. Their military capability has been diminished significantly. That's a positive thing from the U.S. perspective. So yes, we've given Ukraine a lot of weapons, but they've been used to diminish Russia's military capability, for at least conventional military capability, still have enormous nuclear capability for a period of time. So that's a net plus from a U.S. strategic standpoint. But here's the problem for the U.S. What Ukraine war has shown is that in a conventional conflict, weapons can be consumed at enormous rates. I think much more than the West anticipated. So, and there's a problem with the American defense industrial base and just keeping the weapons flowing. I mean, it's not enough to have small numbers of these things. You have to have massive numbers of these things to keep up the volume of fires. So one of the hurdles to implementing the new strategy is to revamp the defense industrial base. I mean, take submarines. We're producing about 1.5 attack submarines a year. There's a deficit of submarines. Submarines are important in the Western Pacific. That's not a problem that's easy to quickly remedy. It's a product of concluding that the Cold War was over and spiking the ball in the end zone a little too soon. So these are sort of the bigger challenges that have to be met if you're really going to make this strategy real. It's one thing to announce the new strategy. The Trump administration did that, and so now has the Biden administration. That's the easy part. The hard part is implementing the strategy and doing so consistently over a period of a decade and longer.